Hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of our Tuesday evening webinars. And in these webinars, we often have presenters who talk about many topics that we face in the 21st century, many issues, many problems, and we get a speaker to deal with particular issues. What we usually do is we have a presenter who makes a presentation for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we invite people who come on to put questions and to raise comment. Now, in this webinar, we're going to concentrate on human trafficking. Now, we've done several meetings and webinars on human trafficking before. We've looked at child trafficking, we've looked at human trafficking in this country, we've looked at human trafficking internationally, and we've looked at the different types of trafficking there is. But in this webinar, we've got Jennifer, who you can see here. She's told me not to try and pronounce her second name because it's impossible, so I won't, or else I'll get totally tongue-tied. But she specializes in looking at human trafficking in business and how business can help with this and how they can comply with this and what they can do, what the difficulties are. And that's a big issue, clearly, because lots of trafficking, for example, is forced labor. And so the role of businesses and supply chains becomes particularly important. And Jennifer runs a social enterprise. So in a way, she is working on a social enterprise that does good by trying to do something about the trafficking issue. Anyhow, we've got Jennifer, and she's just going to present now. We've also got Terry here, and Terry is going to help with the questions when we come to the questions and the comments once Jennifer is finished. Anyhow, Jennifer, thank you for doing this, and I'm going to hand over to you now to do your presentation.
All right, thank you, Francis. And good evening to everybody out there, and thank you for joining us for this important presentation and webinar. As Francis said, the focus of this is human trafficking and modern slavery, specifically from the perspective of the role it plays in our global economy. So there'll be other aspects of human trafficking, modern slavery that you may not be as familiar with. This, or you may be more familiar with, but this one is how it is forming such an integral part of our global economy and why it remains such an integral part of our global economy, and then what we can do about it. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue. So for the next 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is go through the slides that I had prepared, and I'm going to be addressing several aspects of this topic. One, which is a very critical issue, which is not as simple as it seems. It has to do with the definition of modern slavery. What exactly is modern slavery? Second, I'm going to address why contemporary slavery, modern slavery, is such an ingrained part and a structural part of our global economy. And then finally, I'm going to tell businesses what they can and soon must do, as well as what individuals can do to start to reverse the trends that we're seeing in the world, relying on slave labor, and then follow with questions and answers. So first, let me start with some statistics. The numbers are difficult to pin down because this is a hidden crime. So you'll see them change all the time. Currently, the International Labor Organization estimates that there's between 40 and 45 million people currently living in the world today as modern slaves. And it's a very profitable industry, bringing in $150 million in global profits annually. Like I said, it's very difficult to get these numbers. This isn't something that official statistics can keep up with because of the hidden nature of it. It takes place kind of in underground networks, victims who don't even really realize that they're victims, industries that are engaging in modern slavery practices that might not consider themselves to be engaging in modern slavery practices. But essentially, it is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world today, and it is the second largest criminal industry worldwide. Second only to the illegal drugs trade, and it's just in front of the illegal arms trade. So the numbers are really growing in the last several decades, and at a very alarming rate. So going into what is modern slavery, what does modern slavery look like? A lot of us have preconceived ideas of what modern slavery might be or what it looks like. And I think a lot of people, they tend to have images like this that come to mind. Slaves in chains, people who are taken from their homelands, transported to another country, images that we think of when we think of the transatlantic slave trade that existed between the 15th and the 19th centuries. And images like this, while shocking, and I can't say that this sort of slave trade is not existing in the world today, certainly it does, but this is not what we're talking about when we talk about modern slavery. Rather, when we are talking about contemporary slavery, it's looking more like this. So these are incidences, photographs taken of victims of modern slavery across the globe. Of course, the sex trafficking industry, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, as well as in first world countries. The fishing industry, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, relies in a large part on slave labor. The gold mines and mining in general is another huge sector where modern slavery is present. The picture here is a gold mine in Ghana, and the people that are working the gold mine are sifting through pools of mercury, which is poisonous, and become very, very, very sick from the work that they're doing there. And then also pictures from the Rana Plaza accident, which occurred April 24th, 2013, in which over 1,130 people died as a result of structural problems in a building that the owners knew about, that was very, very apparent. They had closed the building to everybody else except for the workers in these particular factories that were supplying a lot of the clothes to the high street retailers that we all buy from. And then it also exists in the UK. And these are all pictures of modern slavery in the United Kingdom. You see it quite often in car washes, nail salons, the agricultural industry, also the drug cultivation, illegal drug cultivation industry. There's a great deal of modern slavery going on there. Certainly the sex industry. There is a large amount of girls and women who are trafficked here to the United Kingdom to work as sex workers. And so I want to go next into what the forms of modern slavery are. And let me just go over a couple of them. Certainly modern slavery, the definitions, and it does vary by jurisdiction, but there's a general agreement when we're talking about slavery in the global economy. There certainly are people who are born into captivity or sold into captivity under more like the transatlantic slave trade like model, but that's not the most common form. You typically see that there's some countries, Mali, Mauritania, where technically it is illegal. On the books, it's illegal. Slavery is illegal, but in practice, it's very open practice. It still exists, and it's part of the culture there and part of the economy there in some African countries. But also, you see it in cases of ethnic hatred, religious hatred, cases of war, extreme versions of misogyny, where some categories of people have essentially been just dehumanized. And that leads to capture and enslavement. But more commonly, what you see is forced labor situations. And those are circumstances, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later, where you have debt bondage. So an individual will get into a family, sometimes you inherit a debt, and they'll get into a situation where they owe money to somebody else. And that could be for the fees that they incur in the cost of transport to another country where the job may be located. It could be a loan that's taken out in order to pay hospital bills or medical care for a family member. But the debt that's owed becomes bonded in exchange, because you don't have money to pay off the debt. You're essentially giving your labor to that individual for free, and then they can then sell you to somebody else who can use your labor. Also, psychological and physical coercion as well keeps people into modern slavery situations. And then I think it's important to talk about the aspect of economic coercion. and the fact that there are many cases where a person needs a job in order to live. They need work to live. And that need in and of itself is the coercion that forms that, the modern slavery, the bondage situation. Child labor is considered modern slavery as well. You see that in particular industries in particular, and in certain cultures and geographic regions throughout the world. And then modern slavery can also consist of unsafe work conditions. So extreme hours, work hours that are just 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also can have areas where, like the Rana Plaza situation, where you had overcrowding, structural risks, and locked exits. So people can't escape the situation in order to escape from the harm, or exposure to toxins, like I was showing you with the gold mining industry in Ghana. And additional forms of modern slavery that I'm not really covering so much today, because they're not part of our global economy. They're more of a business model in and of themselves, and that is sex trafficking, which makes up almost 50% of the human trafficking that you hear about. In addition to forced marriages and child marriages, which result in lifelong situations where somebody becomes basically a domestic servant that isn't free to leave the situation, is slavery. And the domestic servitude, as well as organ harvesting. Going back to this slide, I think that something that's important to discuss is the concept of freedom, because most of the people that enter into these situations are doing so voluntarily, at least initially. They're doing it of their own free will. What has been sold to them may not be exactly what they're getting, but they're not being abducted and held hostage. Instead, what we're looking at, and the reason why it's still considered modern slavery, has to do with the concept of freedom. And freedom has always been sort of defined as this is a freedom from something. But instead, I would encourage people to look at it as being willing to accept a situation that is sometimes inhumane, unsafe, unconscionable, because that person is lacking a better option. And when you lack a better option, how can you truly be free? And that's something, it's a concept that modern slavery charities and people who are working in this particular field are trying to help people understand that it's not the slaves in chains that you were thinking from the transatlantic slave trade, but rather it's a lack of option for extremely vulnerable people in the world that don't have the ability to say no to certain situations. So I want to now go into why. So why is modern slavery so endemic, systemic in our global economy? Frequently, you hear two justifications or two explanations for why modern slavery exists, and that is poverty and globalization. And poverty and globalization is sort of another way of saying, well, there's a supply, the poor people have the need, and then globalization, there's this demand. We have these, the supply chain has become a global supply chain that we're all drawing from and relying on to produce the products that we need. But I think that's really an oversimplification of the issue. And instead, this particular chart that I'm showing right now comes from a scholar named Genevieve LeBaron, who's at the University of, I can't remember, I think Sheffield, here in the UK. And she really does a good job of breaking down exactly what those aspects are of the supply and the demand. And certainly poverty it creates an extremely vulnerable group of people. Vulnerable people are willing to accept conditions that other people wouldn't be willing to accept. And as long as there's that group of vulnerable people, there's going to always be people who are going to take advantage of that. Another aspect of supply, identity and discrimination. And again, I spoke about that in terms of certain aspects or certain people have been dehumanized, whether it's women, girls, who aren't really seen as true human beings that should have all the rights that other people have, or whether it's because of some hatred based on religion or ethnicity. Limited labor protections, there's laws in many countries that essentially, or no lack of laws in many countries, that are creating pools of labor that are prevented, that are just ripe for exploitation. They're prevented from forming networks and collaborating to enforce labor protections that other people have. And then finally, restrictive mobility regimes. And that has to do with people who, if you're on one side of a border, you lose the ability, you're condemned to a life of poverty. If you're on another side of that border, you have access to the jobs, you have access to the resources and the opportunities, and laws that are in place that keep people from being able to access the jobs and the resources they need to lift themselves out. On the demand side, concentrated corporate power and ownership, and that's a really big one. I'm going to switch to the next slide really quick because I think it's important. I love this slide. It's a very simple one, but I think it's a very important one. And this shows in the last 40 years what is really taking place in terms of growth in the global economy. There is growth, but where is that growth going? Because of corporate consolidation, you're seeing corporations and individuals taking the profits at a rate extremely outpacing, well, basically taking all of them. Essentially, if you look at this graph, it's really taking all of them. You've got most of the people living in this world whose income has stayed the same since 1980, despite the growth in the global economy, versus the top 0.1%. And that's where the wealth is being created, and that's also where the power is being created. And I think that's a consequence of neoliberalism and capitalism that is causing that additional demand. Outsourcing practices, it's really basically a way of diluting responsibility. So we're going to outsource our products and the manufacturing to another country or to a different area, and it reduces the responsibility and of the corporation that's providing for those contracts. And then we have irresponsible sourcing practices. So that has to do with time and cost pressures that are put on suppliers that businesses sometimes put that create additional stress for people lower down in the supply chain, and which also increases modern slavery, as well as governance gaps. Governance gaps represent laws that exist on the books, but that are not enforced. So there's especially in the academic world, there's a large number of people who see the term modern slavery as almost more problematic than helpful. And those people feel that when you say modern slavery or human trafficking, that's something the whole world can get behind. I mean, everybody can get behind, from Putin to Trump to any leader anywhere in the world. Everybody can pretty much universally say, yeah, modern slavery is bad. Human trafficking is bad. We're going to put some resources into that. We're going to fight this. But those academics would argue that we're actually doing a disservice because it's these issues right here on the political economy of forced labor. It's these particular issues that make up the supply and demand that people are less willing to talk about because they're too politically controversial. So modern slavery legislation has really been taking off all over the globe. It started with the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, and this is what applies to businesses. And that was modeled in the United Kingdom with the UK Modern Slavery Act. There's also laws for the US federal acquisitions. There's laws in France, the Netherlands, and an upcoming law in Australia. And what these laws are doing is it is requiring businesses to be transparent about what they're doing. It's recognizing, these are laws that are reacting to this recognition that there is no way that we're going to combat these issues and fight the inequality and the modern slavery and the labor exploitation that's going on across the world unless we get business to lead the fight. So that's this That's what these laws are designed to do. And all of them apply to corporations, businesses in their respective jurisdictions that are over a certain threshold amount, annual global revenue threshold. And in the UK, it's pretty high. It's 36 million pounds. I can't remember what it is in California. US federal acquisitions is contracts worth more than $500,000. So the companies that are really at the top, the countries that have the most influence and the most power to make a difference, are affected by these laws. And what you're seeing is that they are being required to put practices in place and to be transparent about the practices they're putting in place that say, we don't have all the answers. We don't know how we're going to fix modern slavery, but here's what we're doing to try. And then it's going to be sharing of resources, sharing of information across the sectors to figure out what the best practices are in order to fight this. And so these are all very new laws. UK Modern Slavery Act went into effect in 2015, and reporting just became mandatory for all companies in 2017. So it's very much an emerging area of law that people are starting to take a look at, and big businesses are already addressing. What you're seeing now, and the reason why it's so relevant to not just the big businesses, is this trickle-down effect. So you're seeing kind of the second tier. You have big businesses that are coming forward and saying, this is our supply chain. We're being transparent about where we're getting all of our products from and what we're doing to try to weed out labor exploitation in our supply chains. We don't want to profit from it. And virtually every company is going to say, we don't want to profit from modern slavery and human trafficking. But because we're doing this, we are now going to be looking at our suppliers. So they're going to be looking at their first tier and the second tier of their supply chains and transferring that to the smaller companies. So eventually this is going to be affecting everybody. This is going to be affecting all businesses because of that trickle down. If you're going to want to do business with the John Lewis's, if you want to do business with the Sainsbury and the Tesco's, you're going to have a plan in place and say, this is what we're doing to identify and eradicate modern slavery in our supply chain. And what businesses are being required to do. And again, this is at a minimum. This is not businesses, the big businesses who are subject to comply with the requirements of the law. But you really need to engage businesses at a director level. And the laws reflect that. The laws require these modern slavery statements to be adopted and passed by the board of directors, and to be apparent and on the websites, on the homepage of these big companies, so people can see what they're doing about it. And it requires companies to really go in and take a human rights risk assessment of their industry, regardless of the industry. It doesn't matter how big your industry is. It doesn't matter what sector you operate in. It could be a high-risk sector. It could be a low-risk sector. But go in and say, here's where we're identifying our risks. And then it's coming up, and here's what we're going to do about it. So the modern slavery due diligence plan. Here's what our organization is going to do on this. Nobody's expecting the problem to be solved. Nobody's expecting an organization to say, we can absolutely guarantee there's no modern slavery going on in our organization or supply chain. That's not the goal. The goal is to get people to have a conversation and to do something and to say, this is what we're doing. And then finally, workforce training. The more people that know about this, the more people that know what the signs are, the more awareness there's going to be about this globally. And as individuals, what can you do? And I think that is on an individual level, really the word needs to get out. These are very, very simple things that you can see if you keep your eyes open and you're looking for them. And just to be able to spot the signs of modern slavery, because it is going on everywhere. Typically, you see a worker who is withdrawn or not engaged, doesn't speak English, and there's somebody else that's there that's kind of overseeing everything that person's doing. So if there's interaction with a customer, then there'll be a third person who sort of comes in and takes over that conversation, maybe handles the money or answers the question. That's a pretty big indicator that person is not being held in legal circumstances. You'll see people with like unkempt appearances or people with clothes that are not appropriate to the job that they're doing. And then living quarters. You see many, many people living in one particular housing unit or block, and windows are blacked out. That's also a good sign that they may be trafficked individuals. And when you see that on an individual level, There is, if you're in the UK, a helpline that it doesn't hurt to call, and just, in fact, you're encouraged, call and just report it, even if you're wrong. They'll go in and they'll be able to do the investigation and find out whether in fact that is what's taking place. So just being aware that there is a resource out there and there's something that you can do when you see the signs. Because frequently the victims of modern slavery are like the least sympathetic people. I mean, the least visible and the least sympathetic people that you'll see. And they don't get the attention that this crime so much warrants. And then finally, examine your own consumer spending habits and consider things. I think about how we're contributing as consumers to the global economy and what our expectations are. Things that 20 years ago, how many outfits did people have? I mean, look at the size of closets in homes that were built 100 years ago versus homes that are built now. The massive stuff that we accumulate as individuals and as households has increased exponentially. And a lot of that stuff is disposable goods, disposable fashion, almost disposable furniture now. How often do you go out to eat? More often, nails. How often do you get your nails done? Certain things, services, as well as things that maybe they're luxuries, but they don't seem like luxuries anymore. And I would just say, think about that stuff and why the cost is suddenly affordable. It's likely because somebody somewhere in the supply chain is being exploited. But sourcing justice. So as Frances said, I have a social enterprise called Sourcing Justice. And what we do is we work with businesses to help them identify and eradicate modern slavery risks in their organization and supply chain, and then help them demonstrate compliance with the UK Modern Slavery Act. So I would just encourage anyone that has any further questions, to get in touch with me. The contact information is here.
That's great, thanks. That was a really thorough presentation. We're getting some questions come up already. Let me start by asking you, Jennifer, I mean, you talked about legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, for example, in the UK and all the other ones in other countries as well. I mean, is that enough? Because, I mean, you go in and you work with companies and you try to get them to adopt practices that doesn't involve slavery in any way. But do they sort of turn a blind eye sometimes to their supply chains, or is their supply chain so complicated because a product very often has a multitude of companies involved that they just don't have the time to investigate it? I mean, is that part of the problem, the complexity of it, and how do you get around it?
Well, these are extremely complex issues. And when you take, I don't want to pick on any particular company, but let's just take a Tesco or a Sainsbury's or John Lewis. Their supply chains, I mean, they operate in at least 100 countries all over the globe. The products, the raw materials that form the basis of their supply chains, they're extremely complex. And when you say, is this legislation going to be enough? The answer is, this legislation is the first step. It's the first step because otherwise nothing is being done. And it is focusing on, I think it's effective. A lot of people have different opinions about this type of legislation. It is going to grow, and more countries are adopting similar legislation. So it's not going away. I think it's valuable. And I think it's valuable because you're seeing companies start to become transparent. You're seeing companies, rather than saying, oh no, we don't have modern slavery, we're completely against that. Well, that's not addressing the issue, because it does exist. Instead, it's saying, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to shed some light. We're trying to get this out, to say this is going on, and here's how we're trying to stop it. And these companies that have the power, that have the leverage, are then applying to their suppliers. And the idea is that those suppliers are then going to apply the pressure on their suppliers. And gradually, it will reach the raw materials, which is really where most of the slavery is taking place.
Yeah. Okay, I just one more question before I come to Terry. I mean, when people think about trafficking, they think it's all criminal activity. They think it's criminal consortium setting up and engaging people in forced labor and so on. But from what you're saying, it's a lot of businesses are not criminals at all. They may be unethical, or they may be just ignorant of what's going on. And so we've got to be aware, haven't we, that it isn't just a criminal issue, it's an awareness issue as well.
Exactly. And that is something that I think is a really important point. And thank you for highlighting that. Because yes, it is a criminal enterprise. Certainly people are profiting off of this and they're doing it knowingly. But more commonly what you're seeing and why it's part of our global economy is that it's not being done consciously. Companies aren't saying we want to profit from this. Instead, they're outsourcing their manufacturing. They're outsourcing essentially responsibility, and it's creating these barriers where you don't know what's going on and maybe you're choosing to look the other way. And so this legislation is saying it's time to stop. Companies, you can't choose to look the other way. You have to look beyond what's happening. So when you're sourcing this out, when you're hiring this company to manufacture your clothes, that's not where your responsibility is ending. Go a little bit further.
There's a question from Lizzie, who raises something about the military. And she says that in some parts of the world, the military has actually more power than the government in that part of the world. So is this something, and she says that they can be involved in unethical practices. So do you think there are parts of the world where the military is playing a part in modern slavery?
You know, I haven't heard that. Certainly in some situations, I could see that would absolutely be the case. I would say it would be country specific, maybe geographical region specific or conflict specific. I would envision that if the military is getting involved, it has more to do with maybe an ethnic issue or maybe a war crimes issue. I've not heard of situations where military is taking the place of the government in order to enforce labor regulations and labor laws. But certainly in many, many areas of the world, that is where the power is. And wherever there's power is exploited.
You did, I mean, Elisa also talked about education, and you said that very often people enter slavery voluntarily. Mm-hmm. And they're sort of groomed in it, or they go in not knowing, and then they find themselves enslaved. Mm-hmm. Lisa says, for example, in sex exploitation, that maybe we should have better education in schools about that. But that's true of the other areas, like forced labor and so on, isn't it? How do we get people who are likely to be victims aware of what might happen?
You know, and that is something that people who work in the human trafficking, especially victim support areas, are really, really focusing on. And that is going to, there's source countries and their destination countries. And just to take an example, let's just take Europe, for example. Typically, it's the Eastern European countries that form the source of some of the human trafficking, and the Western European countries are more of the destination countries. Going into those communities where the criminal gangs are profiting the most, it really is requiring cooperated efforts, concerted efforts by law enforcement, Europol, to share information, to share resources, and then identify those areas and then target those communities, those segments, those populations where most of those people are coming from, and educate them and say, when you're getting this job offer, this great job in Glasgow that's going to pay you this, and you're going to be able to send money and send it back to your family, it's only going to cost you, $3,000 to get there, and they'll pay for your housing, and you're not going to be able to actually get any money for a while. To help people understand that this is not the reality of the situation. And so certainly education can go a long way. It can go a long way in terms of just the general public being aware of what the signs are. But I think more effectively, it can be targeted to the populations where most of the exploitation is coming from.
There's a question from Neil, and it's really about the link, which I think you've already made, Jenny, between us as consumers and slavery. I'll read the question out verbatim. He says, how on earth are you going to get people to evaluate their consumer habits in a mass consumerism society where people are bombarded with advertising everywhere they turn? Brands are so important to some people. They want shoes and bags with well-known brand names where the goods are made by people earning $2 a day, but sell in the West for £100 or more. And he asks, are you seriously saying that directors aren't going to put profits before people?
that's so well worded, because that hits on so many of the issues and so many of the problems. So Neil, thank you for that question. It is going to require a lot, frankly. The people that I've worked with, the companies that I've worked with, without question, every single one of them say to me, customers don't care. Customers don't care. They just want low prices. They've gotten used to buying, 10 t-shirts for £5 each. And that's what they want, and they don't actually care. And I think that that's probably true for a large number of people. But I think that there's several things that are going to need to take place in order to get people to change that behavior. And one of them is businesses to stop focusing on the short-term profits and to get business leaders involved. Anybody who's got a sustainable approach to their company and their company's profits are going to need to look beyond short-term profits and really look into where are you going to get the long-term profits from. And that is not at the expense of the people at the bottom of your workforce. That's not at the expense of outsourcing all of your products to other countries where the labor is cheaper and unregulated. But I also think that it's easy to get a little bit cynical. I get cynical at times, for sure. But I think the younger generation, there is a growing group of people in the younger generation that does care about this, that is looking at this. There's a movement known as minimalist, where it's the opposite. It's the reaction to, I'm American, so America, everything's big, and people have big closets and big houses and big garages with lots of toys and things, and it's just, the more stuff you have, it's almost a status thing. Well, there's a backlash to that you're seeing in the younger generations, and that is the minimalist. And that what is it that we actually need? And to think about things more responsibly. And I like to think that movements like this are going to start to influence corporate decisions.
I mean, you've talked about forced labor, and obviously, I mean, the three main areas of trafficking are forced labor, sex trafficking, and domestic servitude. Now, I mean, do you look at the area of domestic servitude? Because, I mean, are there agencies that are working to, put people into domestic positions who they know are going to be enslaved? I mean, or do you have agencies who just put them in and then forget about them and don't know what's happening? Do you work with those people as well?
I haven't directly worked with them, but I have worked with companies that rely on recruiters, so different industries. But in terms of like office staff, like housekeeping staff for offices, is the closest that I've worked with directly. Again, it has to do with the outsourcing. It's the outsourcing of responsibility, and it creates the ability to not look at what's really going on. And in terms of domestic servitude, that is, I mean, I do know that is going on. In particular, African countries supplying domestic labor to countries in the Middle East, wealthier countries in the Middle East, is getting to be a problem that more and more attention is being given to. And I would just say that anytime you see a recruitment agency that specializes in low-skilled labor, it's something to keep your eyes open for. It's really something that those are red flags, that there's some exploitation going on.
But this goes back, Jenny, to your slide where you have the 4 supply side issues and the 4 demand side issues. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that big business increasingly just treats human beings, treats all of us as consumers, which goes back to Neil's question, as consumers or as producers of wealth. And it seems, you see, those 8 things you listed, almost all of them apply even to those of us who don't consider ourselves slaves. The problems of outsourcing affect us all. The problems of concentrated corporate power and limited labor protection. And I'm beginning to wonder, rather than thinking of modern slavery as something sort of different out there, it seems to me it's just the sort of extreme end of something we're all tied up with, either as consumers or as exploited workers. And I wonder I'd be interested to hear your comments on that notion.
No, and Terry, that was very, very eloquent, and thank you for making that point, because it's exactly the challenge, and that is getting people to see modern slavery beyond that idea of slaves in chains or girls being held in brothels against their will. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist and that that's not important, but the challenge is the fact that modern slavery is very much a predictable, logical part of the system that we've set up. It is normal. And that's difficult to understand, but that is exactly what's happening. And I think that is actually the change that's taking place with a lot of this legislation. People are starting, it's slow. And it's occurring at the top organizations, and gradually it will trickle down. It will take many, many years to do so, if not decades. But gradually, that is exactly what we need to do. It's that shift in our mind that says, this is not some criminal enterprise that bad people are doing because they're bad people. But this is the system that we've set up. This is the structure of our global economy. And when we look at inequality and the growth, the increasing levels of inequality that are taking place, what are the things that are enabling that to happen? And if we actually want to make a difference, if we don't just want to have this 0.1% of extremely powerful people in the world that have earned everything on the backs of slaves and an increasingly growing poorer population, more disenfranchised, less powerful, then we're going to have to start seeing it as normal. This is it. This is logical. This is the system. And now that we recognize it, now that we can say, okay, this is what's going on, it kind of changes the conversation, in my opinion, because we all feel responsible for the solution versus just saying it's these criminal people who are exploiting people and making money for it.
Lisa's just put up some material that I think is for information about the military, so people please look at that if you're interested. But the question that Terry asked and the point that Neil raised about companies making profits and so on is an important one. But Peter raises a point that this could be exasperated in the future because of the way in which our economy is going, because, for example, robots and artificial intelligence and so on, we're moving towards a gig economy. So when we're moving towards a gig economy where people are in and out of jobs, it's hard to keep track of them, and it's hard to regulate them. That almost makes it a fertile ground, doesn't it, for slave labor? And how do you approach that? How do you deal with the gig economy? You're dealing with big corporations, but for people going in and out, how do you actually regulate that? How do you make people aware of that?
And when you say the gig economy, are you talking about, give me an example of what you're kind of referring to?
Well, there were in my day, I could get a job and I could get it for life. But nowadays, young people are going into a job, into Weatherspoons or into Pret-a-Manger, and they've got degrees for 2 or 3 months or a couple of years, and they're going off to do something else, and they're back into the waitress trade again, and they're off to do something else because jobs don't last forever. So they're in and out, and as robots take over very often, and there's more artificial intelligence, there will be less of these unskilled jobs around. And so there's going to be a whole pool of people out there who might voluntarily go into forced labor situations because they've got nothing else, and then they're captive.
And to that, I would say we need to re-envision what we need to do as a world, as a society, because I do think you could have, I think you are having an upcoming seminar on AI and the implications that it's having in the global workforce. And I certainly am not going to pretend to be an expert in this topic, but it's one that's certainly very fascinating to me, and one that I think is going to become more and more in our face in terms of our economy. But we've got to kind of rethink things as not just as individuals, but as a global society, as a global community of business leaders, and reevaluate the neoliberalism and the capitalism that has formed the foundation of this global economy. Because as things advance, and as you have AI and jobs, low-skilled jobs that are being taken over, we are going to have needs. There's an amazing graphic out there on the the global population and how it has so exponentially expanded just in the last 20 years. And it really is a good illustration to get some insight into, we have to stop running the world by the rules that we were using in the past.
Maria's asked a question, are 0 hours contracts in the slavery bracket? And I'd like to add something to that, because I think there's a danger here. We don't want to minimize the horrific conditions in which some of the people that you've referred to work. But, so in a way, it seems wrong to compare somebody who's on a 0 hours contract to that total lack of control over your life. But I actually wonder whether it's the same attitude in all those cases. You see, I heard a story about a graduate who was accepted onto very highly paid training scheme to become a trader for one of the banks. So he doesn't sound like a slave at all. But he, from this training course, he asked just for 1 day off to go to his parents' birthday party. And they said, oh yeah, that's fine, go, but leave your phone behind and never ever come back. Wow. So that sort of, even at that high level of pay, that feeling that the company owns the person, I believe do you think that's probably at the heart of this? Whether it's 0 hours, highly paid people expected to have no private life, or people working in dreadful conditions in a car wash.
And I do think there is a difference, and somewhere you need to draw a line. And certainly the definition, and all the definitions of modern slavery that are accepted in any jurisdiction wouldn't include something as a 0 hours contract. What we're talking about when we talk about 0 hours contracts is basically companies just taking advantage of the labor pools that they have because they can, and it's more profitable for them. So that is more of a, when I was talking about we have to change the way the game is played, that is more of a corporate culture issue that is taking advantage of people. I think that it's important when you're talking about modern slavery that there's a recognition that the victims come from very, very vulnerable population segments. And when you have a skilled professional who's not getting the job that he or she wants, or the hours that he or she wants, or the time off that he or she needs, what we're talking about is just a bad company that they're working for, that doesn't care about their employees, doesn't value their employees, that takes advantage of their employees, that hopefully doesn't stick around in the marketplace for very long. Modern slavery is about exploiting people who are vulnerable. And I think that's where the difference would lie.
A lot of these questions are mega questions, like, our economy is a capitalist one, it's corporate controlled, they're out for profit, labor is owned by companies, what can we do about it? It's almost a recipe for despair. But you're not having that despair. You're saying there's something I can do about it. I can't wait for the socialist revolution to come tomorrow. It may not come for 100 years, but there's still people in slavery. I've got to do something now to try and do what I can do. So do you have a more hopeful approach rather than wait for the millennial revolution?
I may be an optimist. I believe that this legislation that you're seeing pop up around the globe, starting with California, moving to the UK, moving to Australia, it's far from perfect. It is far from perfect, but it is starting to take a real look, and it's forcing companies to take a real look at what's going on. And rather than simply say, rather than giving the companies the app to say, we respect human rights, we are against modern slavery, we don't accept that in any part of our business, and end of story. It's forcing companies to go beyond that. And that's where I see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's where I see these companies really do have power. No, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen this decade. But imagine the alternative, I guess is where I would just say. And so my optimism comes from the fact that we're not dealing with the alternative, which is nothing. Okay.
Terry, have you got another point?
Well, Neil says, and I think it's come just back to the link with consumerism. He says one way the government measures how healthy the economy is by headlining how much profit big high street stores are making. So in a sense, the government there is, wants the high street stores to make as much profit as possible because it makes the government look good. But on the other hand, the government is also saying, but we don't, obviously want you to do this in a way that's exploitative.
Again, and Neil's absolutely right. I would say that business leaders, good business leaders need to look beyond short-term profits. And that is the structure. That is how things are set up. That is the reason a CEO is appointed, is to deliver profits to the shareholders. And I believe that there's a growing number of investors, of shareholders, of people who are looking beyond that and to looking more at growth and economic health that's more in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that are looking at things more holistically, that are looking at what's going on, not just in terms of exploited labor, but looking on what's going on to the environment. I mean, to the global warming situation, the sustainability of the environment that we're all operating our businesses on. And by necessity, I believe that the conversations are going to have to change. And I do believe that there may be generations of thinking that are on their way out and being replaced. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require some re-identification of what our values are as businesses, as human beings, as societies, as governments. And I do think that that's starting to take place.
I mean, in the work that you do you concentrate mainly on the supply side, the corporates, the outsourcing, or do you also look and deal with the demand side? For example, in your presentation, you talked about identity and discrimination on the demand side. Now, that's a cultural issue, isn't it? It's not just about structures and corporations. It's about how culture has developed over years, forced marriage, arranged marriages, all sorts of things like that. Do you tackle that, or do you just concentrate on the supply side and the working with companies?
I would absolutely love to work on the supply side, but I believe more change, I could be more effective working on the demand side. So there are things that are ingrained in cultures. There are values that enable modern slavery in certain areas in the world, in certain cultures, and certainly with women in particular and children in particular, that these are things that I'm not equipped to address. But what I can affect is more on the legal side, the government frameworks, the policies, and the business side of it. So that's what I focus on.
Okay, Terry?
And Lizzie suggests that maybe we need more women in business. And she says also that we need more Oprah Winfreys. So,
yeah, no, I do think, sometimes I envision a world that was created where women had the power from the get-go, and how different it would look today. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. I mean, obviously it doesn't exist, and it's probably, it's impossible to happen at this point, because the structures of society, our economic system, our political system, everything has been structured around a different value than that I think women more intrinsically have. But certainly the right direction would be more diversity, and be gender diversity as well in positions of power.
It's interesting, everybody's heard of chimpanzees, but almost nobody's heard of bonobos, who look very like they look almost identical to chimpanzees, but the women are in charge in bonobos. And I sometimes wonder whether, we've been deliberately, that knowledge of that particular species of ape has been kept from us.
Especially if it was a wonderful, fruitful, utopian society.
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay, so I mean, people on here, you've had quite a lot of different views. Some very interested in what you're doing, some interested in what they can do, some saying we can't do much until we bring the whole system crashing down. If you were to give any advice to people who want to get involved and help you in doing the sort of things that you're doing, what's the sort of advice you would give them, Jennifer?
Well, I would have different conversations with individuals than I would with businesses. When it comes to an individual level, and we're talking kind of about the supply side and what can be done there, I'm a huge fan. I mean, this is like the modern slavery helpline number. Keep a copy of it handy. I've got, if you need anything, I've got cards, I've got flyers, I've got little key fobs and stuff that if anybody wants, I can send them. You'd be surprised how often you're in a social situation or going out shopping or in town on the high street and something's going on right in front of you that you don't see. You just have to know a couple of the signs and then you start to look at it differently. And if you do, I'm saying it doesn't hurt to call. So there is a resource. So on individual level, I'd say that's what you got to do. If you're a business, I would say you should do it because it's the right thing to do. But instead, I think most businesses are going to be motivated because they have to do something. Because legally, they're going to be required to do something, or because of the pressure that's going to be put on them, the business pressure that's going to be put on them from the people that they do business with. So the bigger companies that they want to do business with. And those people, you know, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. It's a huge, huge problem. It cannot be solved. Ideally, it'll be solved by 2030, consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But start with a risk assessment. Just look. I mean, it's not that difficult. I think a lot of companies, it seems like this big unknown, and there's a little bit of fear. It's too big of an issue. We can't even start it. But you eat the elephant one bite at a time. Start with a simple risk assessment. Figure out where your risks are, what we can do in the next year to address those risks. And then 1 year later, come back and say, okay, now what can we do? And how did that work? And what have other industries been doing? And has that been effective? And can we share that information? And my point, my charge, I guess, would be if you're a business, don't ignore this. Do something. It makes business sense and it's the right thing to do.
And I mean, clearly there's a helpline for individuals who think that they have discovered practices which relate to slavery. Is there a helpline for businesses who want to do something? I mean, where do they go when they say, look, how do I create a risk assessment about what I'm doing? How do I identify my supply chains and what they're doing? How do I know my outsourcing is going to companies that won't engage in practices that are dubious? Where can they go?
Well, I mean, self-servingly, they can come to me. This is what I do. This is what sourcing justice is all about. We are a resource for businesses who want to get started in their plan. So, you know, self-servingly come to me. But there are additional resources. You know, without saying that, I'm not going to, I certainly don't hold all the answers. I don't hold the key to the universe of unlocking the problems, the challenges of modern slavery in this world. There are a resource of materials available on the internet that you can look at. And they're kind of starting points. Frankly, I don't think most organizations would have the time or expertise to really devote something to that, you know, enough attention to that just as a little thing that they're putting an employee in charge of on the side. It can be a little bit intimidating process. I would say consult with somebody. There's also NGOs that are working in this field. And there's materials out there. If you want to do a risk assessment of your organization, here's where you should start. And just do simple Google searches. But I think my company is somewhat unique in the terms that I'm a lawyer, but I'm not operating a law firm. I'm not a charity. I'm not a for-profit big consultant. I'm a social enterprise that sincerely wants to help businesses make this step to look at things a little differently.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And we sort of come to the end of the webinar now. Jody, by the way, has put up a note saying that Freedom Connections is a database of organizations that work in this field, and it's useful if you use that particular organization and look at that database. So thank you for putting that up. And thank you, Jennifer, for giving us your own take on this really tragic problem, and telling us about the work you do and the importance of businesses being aware and having the right practices. I think it's a really important issue. Now, this has been recorded. I hope to edit it tomorrow, or at the latest, I hope the next day, and it'll be up on YouTube as a recorded webinar video. and people can look at it again or disseminate it and share it to as many people as possible. So thank you for doing it, Jennifer, and thank you for all the questions that have come up, and thank you, Terry, for helping as well. And I'm sure
thank you, Francis.
And I'm sure we'd do some work with you again in the future, Jennifer, because that was really good.
I could talk forever about this.
Yeah, I'm sure you can, and we'll probably give you a chance to do that as well.